Hi everyone, I'm Samantha. I started here in kindergarten, so I've been here for 13 years, and in the fall I'm going to the University of Southern California to study business administration and finance. So my project for 11th and 12th grade was about the integration of immigrants and their descendants in American society, and it was actually a 3-part project. I did 2 separate things in 12th grade, but I'll get to that later. Beginning in 11th grade, the research question that started everything for me was, do social, economic, and cultural challenges hinder the integration of first and second generation immigrants, and does the existing research sufficiently address and reflect these issues? And I really wanted to research immigration, particularly the integration of immigrants, not just their journey to where they're going, but actually what happens when they get here, because I took an English class in 11th grade called Dangers of a Single Story, which is all about that, and it really inspired me to go deeper in this topic. I was also in law at the time, which is a history course here in 11th grade, and I really wanted to look at the policy that shapes immigrant experiences in America. So with that, once I started researching this topic, I realized that it's very complex and nuanced. So in order to organize my research, I categorized it into 3 different areas. First being linguistic integration, so how well immigrants are learning the English language upon arrival and what type of barriers they face in terms of getting a job based on how much English they know and how it affects their life. Then I looked at economic integration, so I looked a lot at wage disparities and how that's influenced by racial prejudice, and I looked at the difference between native-born salaries versus immigrant salaries, especially with comparable educational and skill levels. And then I looked at sociocultural integration, so how well immigrants are integrating into different social groups, and specifically with native-born Americans, and if there are any barriers to that type of integration as well. So, with that, I have a lot to say. It's very hard to summarize it. So in the interest of time, I highlighted 5 statistics that sort of summarize my research and overall findings about the barriers that immigrants face in these 3 categories. The first being that nationally, about half, but 47% of immigrant adults have limited English proficiency, meaning that they struggle to read, to communicate, or to learn English, which impedes their ability to integrate economically or socially, because language proficiency is the #1 metric that determines overall integration. And this is largely because government-funded English learning language programs only meet 4% of the needs of immigrant adults nationally. And there are a lot of issues with location, accessibility, and the lack of flexibility with immigrants' like work schedules, as well as if they have to deal with children. It's just very difficult to access this resource, and the government hasn't put a lot of time or dedication into funding it. So overall, as reflected in the other statistics, immigrants aren't learning English. And this is really important because 53% of those who reported that they have limited English proficiency say that they have faced language barriers in interactions and environments necessary for survival. And I spent a lot of time looking at experiences with healthcare and law enforcement, and just a lack of accessibility in general for fear of retribution, deportation, or just overall not being understood or listened to because of their identity. And then with that, moving more towards the economic side of things, on average, immigrants make 12% less hourly wages than American-born workers, and this impacts all facets of integration because they are not making a living salary or a wage that's appropriate for what they're capable of doing, and this impacts their survival. And with that, it takes approximately 15 years for immigrant earnings to catch up to their native-born counterparts of comparable skill and educational levels. So in summary, it takes a decade and a half for immigrants to just get on the same playing field, let alone to actually thrive within this country, which I believe is a pretty alarming statistic. Okay, so that was sort of the conclusion of my 11th grade project. And then moving on to the first part of my 12th grade project, which I completed over the summer because I took a journalism course with the New York Times, and I really wanted to learn more about nonprofits and community-based organizations helping different immigrant communities in New York City. I thought it was really relevant. I also did some community service in my English class, so I thought this would be a good way to blend everything I was interested in doing into one project. And my research question was, how are community-based organizations in New York City supporting marginalized immigrant groups in the integration process, and what are the challenges they face in doing so without government recognition or financial support? So after I did some research, I interviewed 5 different individuals who encompass different facets of the integration process for nonprofits. They kind of touch on different communities and different locations throughout the city. The first person I interviewed was Ramada Sacco, who is a nurse and lead volunteer at the Association for Senegalese Immigrants, which is up in Harlem. And then I interviewed Ryan Clough, who's an immigration lawyer for Central American immigrants. And then I interviewed Vic Lee, who owns an organization that helps Chinese immigrants. And then I interviewed Michael and Rick, who own an organization that helps find housing for immigrants. And lastly, I interviewed a reporter from Documented, which is a nonprofit newsroom that finds resources for immigrant communities. And with all of their perspectives, I created an article that I published on News Decoder, which is an organization that Hewitt has a partnership with, and it's titled A Growing Need in Shrinking Funds, which covers all of my findings. And then the last part of my project I did in the fall at Hewitt, and my research question was, how do the experiences of being a child of immigrant parents influence students' educational aspirations, cultural identity, and life trajectories in a multicultural context? I completed a semi-structured interview format, and I interviewed 5 Hewitt seniors with this research question. And from that, I was able to code for 4 themes, which were based on my findings from other academic papers and the existing research that I had found in 11th grade. And my themes were academic excellence in higher education, especially because we were all applying to college at the time, so that was particularly relevant. And then the next theme was pressure to succeed, so how being a child of immigrant parents heightens the pressure students feel to succeed academically and socially. Then I looked at cultural connections and belonging and just identity in general. And then I looked at language proficiency, except not English, however, the language of their parents or ancestors, and whether or not they know that language as well. With that, my overall big takeaways, first, based on the last part of my project, for Hewitt specifically, through my research, I found that it could be very helpful to create an affinity space for second-generation students, because overall, all students reported that they feel a sense of isolation based on their experience being a child of immigrant parents, and there's no defined space for them currently, so I think creating this space could be really helpful to foster future conversations. Then moving away from Hewitt to high school specifically, I think offering more language opportunities in general beyond the typical Spanish, French, Latin, etc. could be very helpful, because students who spoke the language of their parents or ancestors overall had a stronger connection to that aspect of their identity. So in order to create a more well-rounded identity, I think that could be very helpful. And then lastly, if I were to continue this research, because I feel as if all of our projects prove the research never really ends, there's always more you can do with it, I think it would be really interesting to connect all parts of my 12th grade project with the research question, how do community-based organizations support the integration of immigrants and their families? So looking at long-term integration, specifically with second-generation individuals, and how community-based organizations help facilitate that. That's it. Thank you.